I forgot to share an important part of the story, the sad story that I was sharing yesterday about a friend acquaintance of mine dying last year that I just found out about yesterday. And the interesting thing was we were talking about this person, and then in the background we were watching music videos, like retro music videos. And the video that was on when we were talking about this person, which we saw after we were talking about them, when we were talking about how sad it was, the name of the artist, the first name of the artist on the TV music video was the same as the first name of the person who passed away. So then I said, oh, they can hear us, they're communicating with us, yeah, woo! So that was cool, and everyone thought it was a neat way to look at it. So now that I talk to myself about how perhaps the feeling of future consciousness of so-called mania is presence, is eternity. Perhaps it's an algorithm of eternity and it has nothing to do with future. So it could be eternity consciousness. And then what happens when we go through the wormhole of brain algorithms back to consciousness of self, which isn't creative, and it's actually non-existent. So the eternity consciousness is existence, whereas living in thought and the feeling of having a separate self is illusion, or maybe Maya, as the Buddhists would say. So what I'm thinking is that history consciousness is naturally attachment, because these thoughts of self, like self-consciousness, people reflecting on themselves psychologically, when there is no psychological entity there, there can be a projection onto the moment, and that projection is based on memories of the past. It's like our own film, which is in our brain that we've recorded. So even if we've gone into so-called mania and gone into, say, a consciousness of presence that doesn't have that much to do with history, personal history, what happens is people around us, like our family and friends, they have those memories for us. So they're in historical consciousness, and they, in their memories, contain recordings of our history. And so they're comparing us to those recordings, and when they see us behaving in ways that aren't historically ourself, and they assume that who we are is that history that they've recorded, then that can be part of what causes this sort of elastic band pulling of gravity into the heaviness of psychological memory of others. And psychiatry helps with that. And so what I see is that this history consciousness is attachment. Maybe we're not super attached anymore, but when we get afraid of being alone in eternity, which can feel like death of the self, we sometimes get afraid, and that fear lowers our vibration, and then we end up being in a vibrational level that thought is able to reattach to us. So imagine if we're in eternity consciousness and it's wonderful, like manic consciousness forever. We might possibly not really have another thought of our family again, because we're not really attached to our history. We're not attached, but we are in full awe and presence of the mystery. So we go from history consciousness based on memories of ourselves, and trying to build on that, and others seeing us that way too, to mystery. And the mystery is a lot more fascinating, though it does require a more energetic brain. So part of what is in the attachment to thought is also becoming better. So eternity consciousness has no concept of a self becoming better, because there is no self there, no separate self, no entity that is thinking. There's perception. So history is based on attachment, projection, and becoming something better. When we're in eternity consciousness, we see that we are all that we ever needed to be. We don't need to be any different. So the whole concept of becoming better inwardly disappears, and what replaces better or worse or good or bad is an infinite richness. There's no this is good and this is bad. There could be good and bad to some extent, but it's never summarized so neatly. Nothing is ultimately good or bad. It can be looked at in so many other ways. And what happens when we get back into historical consciousness, through the gravity of our attachments, the people who are attached to us and their thinking and memories pulls us back into that a lot of times. And what happens is we end up thinking, well, I'm bad because I went into this state of consciousness where I'm not really attached to the people that I should be attached to according to my history, or almost ashamed from naturally detaching from that temporarily. And the punishment is that one gets a lower rank in the family system. They get to become this mentally ill person, and they're basically punished for going into eternity and not participating in the family system becoming better, or what have you, and all the drama that we're all emotionally addicted to. So again, becoming better, that concept disappears in eternity consciousness. And habits are a part of that too. And if we're in habits, we can't be spontaneous. So we'd want to go from habits to spontaneity. And that requires a certain lifestyle design and lifestyle scaffolding to live that way. Because say we have a certain life design of habit and routine, and we go into eternal consciousness, eternity consciousness, and we're no longer even attached to our stuff, really. Sometimes we buy a lot more stuff, but we're not really attached to it. Sometimes we get to the point where we want to just give it all away because we're not attached to it. It's a gesture of feeling not attached to stuff. But the trouble is, even our stuff that we own and identify with can end up making us gravitate back towards being put in that type of lifestyle routine. So if I didn't have any stuff, I didn't have anything attached to me, then what would happen? And people do that. They go into minimalism and they feel a lot different, or they go into wandering or being a digital nomad or something like that, and they don't have very much stuff. And as a result, they're free to go almost anywhere because they don't have to pay rent to keep their stuff contained. So it's just a different way of living. And our subjectivity, our inner space, is being used for the past. So we have this apparent inner space, the inner private space. It's subjective, and it's like this container, and the whole container is being used up by thoughts of the past, like I this, I should that, blah blah, which is comparison and measure. One can only say I should do this if I'm comparing to what I'm doing now, which is that. So and a lot of it is a psychological movement. So it's a matter of moving the psychology in a different way, the inner psychology. So our subjectivity, our I, is being used as a historian. So we're watching our life story, our history sort of play out in our mind's eye and recombine. And if there's this historical algorithm happening, then the creative algorithm can't happen. So, people who are labeled bipolar, they're often thought of, well, it's well known, it's very obvious that people who go into that state of consciousness oftentimes are very creative. It's not a mystery, it's something that they actually study a little bit. Like, how can somebody be so creative and yet be so ill? But the thing is that when historical consciousness algorithm is kind of put in its place or lessened, then there's more energy for the creative algorithm of the brain. Because the I is mainly historical, like I am thoughts are mainly historical. Saying in mind, I should do this, I should do that, I want to be this, I want to do that, isn't the same as seeing something that's right in front of me and creating something with it. And often the should has nothing to do with what we're doing right now at the moment. So it's just a different algorithm in the brain. And I think there's space for both. And since I've lately created this way of looking at it in terms of going between history and memory and a history dominant consciousness to a mystery dominant consciousness, which is more creative. It's like creating the mystery. It's seeing the mystery, and that has a lot of meaning, which is a creative process, because if you're seeing the mystery in the moment and you have a creative, meaningful perception based on that, that's a lot different state than repetitive thoughts going on forever. So it's different. So also this could help because one might be able to realize, hey, I'm around historical figures in my life. I'm around my parents or friends from a long time ago that haven't really changed much. I can operate based on history. I can talk about what I'm doing or this, or talk about memories. But if one's with a peer or somebody who is in the creative algorithm, one could talk in a different way completely. If we talk in a creative mystery algorithm around a psychiatrist, they're likely going to see that as symptoms. So it's perhaps best not to share that stuff unless we really are looking for that type of help, which has its time and place. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm using some of the meds right now to sleep, and I feel there's a way to use the meds more efficiently, and also perhaps getting to know one's rhythms to the point where there's certain times when one doesn't have to take any and doesn't have to do the maintenance treatment thing, which can probably lead to the brain shrinking more if one's on daily antipsychotics, or also weight gain and things that are undesirable like that, which increase the risk for early death, etc. And some of my notes here have a little bit of Steve Pavlina's course on abundance notes, and some days I make more notes than others. I haven't been making that many notes, but really listening to what he's saying. And he talked about violating boundaries, and this makes me think of how I set up this artificial boundary between upstairs and downstairs where I live, even though there's no door separating the two. So just creating my own boundary that way when there wasn't really a boundary there. So people can violate our boundaries, and figuring out what our boundaries are and what doses we can take of what. So I was thinking in terms of, if we have too high of a dose of, say, family members who look down on us, we might need a higher dose of tranquilizers. Whereas if we lessen the dose of that, it's possible that we might need less tranquilizers. And people can figure out these sorts of things on their own over time. something that helps me figure it out a little bit is the Spire breathing device, because what I've learned from it recently is I've been in my friend's coffee shop when the music is on quite loud, and it's world music, nice music, but when it's on loud, my Spire does tons of minutes of tense breathing. But same music is played pretty much every day, and on the days that it's quieter, I don't have as much tense breathing. So then I can see it's not necessarily music or being in coffee shops or whatever that's bothersome as much as how loud the music is, and that is the main trigger, is the loudness of the music, not the music itself. So I don't have to avoid all situations where music is playing that isn't what I would play. So over time, with observation, one is able to make certain distinctions. And another thing I noticed that wasn't related to the Spire was a couple weeks ago I started watching some episodes of Downton Abbey at night. Sometimes I stayed up till 3 in the morning. It was getting a little out of hand, and then I cut it down to like 1 or 2 episodes. Would get to sleep by 12:30. But I noticed how like excited the show made me, like so excited and happy. And so I realized it's kind of like, I don't know if it was just I was getting to the point where I was more energized anyway, or if it helped to bring in the energy, because it was a show that just kind of gets me, I just love the show. It's a great show. So yeah. And I was just thinking that spontaneity creates different behaviors. So perhaps in the future, when more people know about this switch in algorithm of the brain to be more energized and creative, when one is perceiving creatively and meaningfully, that creates different behaviors for sure. And one could say, I am working on my spontaneity. I'm working on being more spontaneous. And spontaneity happens pretty much without any pre-thought, without any pre-formation. So it's hard to stop it from happening in say, so-called mania, but there could be a way to realize when one can shut off that spontaneity. Or, hey, I'm being too spontaneous in how much I'm buying. I'm going to try to stop that. Even me buying these puppets, that was a little bit spontaneous. And I might end up returning them, because if I had my own space, I would keep them. But I'm not really able to talk loudly like I am right now and use puppets as much here. So it could be a good idea, but maybe not the right time. But I don't regret it, because maybe somebody will watch this and be like, hey, I want to create my own meaningful puppet show of being silly like this. So perhaps something I could do is act on those things that I see as creative, and then return them or something, because it was a creative idea, but maybe I'm not going to go with it too far. Maybe I'll keep the dinosaur, and maybe one day get a different monkey that doesn't have flat affect. Maybe after I talk to him long enough, he'll magically transform into a monkey that can talk properly, because they're not as flat. And in terms of the history to creativity type switch, our history is on the inside. It's in our inner subjectivity, in the inner space, if it's talking on about itself. And our creativity is also in that space. So if we have too much history going on, we can't have as much creativity going on. And in terms of the brain mechanism of thought, our whole brain and biology has been mechanized to feel that it needs to take part in the economy as it is. And there could be a different type of economy altogether than this one that we've created in the West. Like economy is creating profits for shareholders. Like, who made that up? The biggest shareholders of life, it's each human being. We each have a share in this earth and this planet, and it hasn't been divided equally. And not that it has to be divided fully equally, but there are certain energies for sure that are suppressing certain things. And not only that, marketing in the economy is based on attaching some kind of psychological meaning, like you will become better or feel better or be greater if you buy this. So these meanings have been attached to things that aren't really real. So you will feel better. Well, the trouble is there is no you. So it's appealing to an illusion, buying something, and buying something to have some kind of illusory stimulation, and it's no wonder that it can never be satiated, because it's not even real. It's a false mechanism that's been created. Steve Pavlina talks a lot about scarcity in this abundance class, because scarcity is the opposite of abundance. And I feel that in our neurotribe of people who have been labeled and pathologized, there is a scarcity of dialogue among us. And part of why I'm creating this dialogue with myself is to start to create more of an abundance of this type of dialogue between us. And part of why it's important to keep it moving between us, between people who have had experience with this other algorithm of the brain, which creates a meaningful, unique experience within, based likely on the present moment, not so much on the future moment, but it's based on eternity. And if we can keep this kind of meaning flowing between us, this meaning that we've created ourselves and we see for ourselves. If I share somebody and that energizes somebody else, and they're like, yeah, I see that, and, which is a principle of improv, then we're not provoking the movement of thought. So when we try to talk to a psychiatrist in the mental health system and convince them of things being different, we're provoking a resistance from all their years of training. So they have all this training and they're really identified and attached to it. So to say something other than that, it's a threat on so many levels. It's a threat to their way of seeing. It's a threat to their livelihood. So I think if we have faith in our own intelligence and the additive intelligence that would be created if we put our brains together, instead of keeping our brains separately and saying, hey, psychiatry, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that. For me, I'm hoping to eventually get to the point where I don't need any of it. Right now I'm using the meds, and I don't have a psychiatrist anymore. It's kind of like the universe saying, hey, yeah, you'll be fine now. You don't need the psychiatrist telling you what to do. Just go to your GP and get the meds that you need. And I've thought about the meds in a different way too. Like, it seems to be an antenna that can keep us somewhat connected to this historical consciousness that is most of the consciousness of mankind. And it sort of creates this link or antenna to it. Otherwise, we'd probably go into our own world and probably not exist in this one. So it could be really important for us to build the bridge, and maybe not even so much build the bridge, but build that other world that we've all seen and experienced, which is based on just the algorithm of the brain changing. It's not really based on needing to do anything. It's not based on doership. It could be based on seership and being able to perceive what is really happening now, and not through the illusions of thought and how thought and experience that we've been conditioned with have programmed our senses to make something salient that's not really even there. So we're seeing an illusion, and we could see what is actual in any moment. So that leads me to talk a little bit about what I wrote down today, because I'm kind of at the beginning of my last notebook, and then I have an older one than that, and then I have a newer one that I'm starting on. But I was writing down something about, which I'll get to later more, but I was writing about how, if this B elixir stuff that I took today improves executive function, which is memory, and cognition, which is based on thought, is there something that would change? Are there certain things that would change the brain's perception of the moment and making meaning and forgetting to make space for perceiving now? And maybe other factors too, but I think there's some factors that are kind of the opposite of what we take to be how the brain should function, that are barriers to perceiving in the moment. And the thing is that when we perceive in the moment, we can energize something that's actual. When we're thinking thoughts, our mind is somewhere that isn't even, it's not real. One might think so-called mania and psychosis aren't real, but the thing with that is our brain sort of going all over the place with what might not be real, which is called like a delusion or a hallucination sometimes. But when somebody's stuck in thought consciousness, one is stuck in a very, very small, limited delusion and hallucination. The difference is when the brain opens up, it can go all over the place and create all kinds of beliefs. But people who are in consensus consciousness are stuck in one sort of belief system. And the root of that belief is the belief in a separate self, the belief in the ego, which it's there in a way, but it's not actual. So and it's really boring because it's repetitive. I actually don't know what boredom is anymore. I don't remember the last time I was bored. Probably many years ago. So I don't really know what people talk about when they say they're bored. And so that's the importance of not provoking thought, not provoking systems of thought like psychiatry. Imagine if we created so much meaning amongst ourselves without provoking psychiatry, and then all of a sudden they're hit by this tsunami of meaning and subjective energy that is quite sure about what it is that this experience means. One of the things it means is that the life we've been programmed and conditioned with is absolutely meaningless. Hence the reason why the brain oftentimes has trouble getting back a lot of the so-called executive function, which just leads to being a cog in the machine. That's what executive function is. So, and it was interesting listening to some of the questions that John Harold was answering after his talk on the process-oriented approach. And somebody was asking a question about whether looking into somebody's eyes can warp us. And it's so interesting because I've talked to myself about that in the past. I've talked about how the light coming out of one's eyes projecting onto us, like how psychiatry is projecting what their knowledge onto us. Yeah, them looking into our eyes is part of what warps our brain, for sure. And I've asked that question and I've answered it for myself in different ways. So I absolutely think that's true. And I've talked about it. So what I'm saying is a lot of these weird things that I've talked about with myself, over time, I've heard other people saying the same thing or wondering the same thing. And how is it that they wonder the same thing when they've had that sense themselves? Because the thing is, too, when we get really perceptive in the moment, we can see very subtle things, like the way somebody looking at us messes with us or changes us. And they see that in science now, too, with the observer effect. So it's the observer effect, but the thing is, when we're very sensitive in that highly energized, sensitized consciousness where our senses are are very in the present moment. We can see what's happening. We can feel it. And then we hear inside like, oh my gosh, the way that they're looking at me is messing me up, or I don't like it. And it's true. But that's just and then we might say, don't look at me, or and freak out, and then we get in trouble. But really, we're responding to something very real. And then there was somebody else that asked another question about something. And I was like, wow, I've also talked to myself about that. So here are people on this call asking things that I've talked to myself about. So I feel that a lot of what I've talked about, other people have thought of themselves, or had an intuition or an insight about themselves. I think that when we start talking to each other more, we'll be like, yeah. And we don't really say that when we're talking to psychiatry. We're like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. This is only trouble. So, yeah, and then I think this is something Steve Pavlina said about help people take the next step. Help people who are behind you. And I don't know who's behind me and who's ahead of me, but I think by sharing with each other, we can get on the same vibe, which is, hey, our experience makes sense. It's very logical and rational when we talk to each other about it, and we can be more sure of that. So we can have one psychiatrist telling us we're bipolar, or we could have 1,000 peers in dialogue with us, and which is more powerful? I think the 1,000 peers in dialogue would help to negate or make obsolete the need for some kind of overarching authority on our experience. And also, part of the reason why they have an overarching authority on our experience is because it's challenging to put this stuff into words and to articulate it. Even if we were able to do that, psychiatry wouldn't have the time. They only have time for like a 5-minute medication appointment. They don't have time to listen. And they're not the right people to listen either. So it turns our audience of being in dialogue on equal footing with each other into talking to one authority figure. It's like psychiatrists or God or something. And it's funny, a lot of people feel like they get into contact with God or some kind of power when they're in their creative state of, that is called in retrospect by psychiatry, mania. And then they end up with some kind of like godlike medical authority figure. So what we do experience as significant and meaningful in our subjective states, often when we switch back into history consciousness, that historical thought stuff comes around us in very congruent ways or equivalent ways to that which we had the inner experience. So instead of feeling like we're in contact and communion with God, now we're in contact with like a psychiatric God. And we also mobilize quite a few people to help us in some way in the mental health system. When that was another thing that John Harold said, that I've said to myself many times before. So it's interesting that he said it, was if it seems like the universe is trying to tell us something and is creating these altered states in certain individuals in order to help the greater community understand these things. And I feel that for sure. And when we're unable to articulate it, what I feel happens is we end up saying symptoms to a psychiatrist. And I unfolded how that could work pretty clearly in a certain video somewhere. Good luck finding it, because none of these have titles or any kind of index. And that is partly because I don't know what has meaning. I really don't know. There's nothing that comes into mind that says, whoa, this is the best ever. Use this to convince people that it's this way. there's none of that. There's no motive to convince. Maybe to illustrate, but not to convince. And hopefully it's something of some kind of value. And, you know, they're kind of like bipolar memes. I don't know why I haven't thought of a different word for that, but... And to me, if somebody has been labeled with bipolar and they lose their functionality, it's kind of like the universe emptying our cup of history and thought and conditioning so the universe can fill us up with itself. And, you know, I don't talk too much about the positive side of that. Anyone who's been in that state knows what I'm talking about. And if somebody who's been in the state of mania could say, hey, I wish that everyone be manic forever, all the time, everyone would want that and everyone would really enjoy it. It would be freaking chaos, but that chaos would probably give rise to a new order that was more intelligent. And can we focus on what we've gained? So if we've lost our executive function to some extent, which is based on history and thought, which would be the means by which we're able to operate as a cog in a machine, what have we lost? I don't think we've lost anything. We've gained the ability to see the meaninglessness of that. And then in that, we often gain the capacity to create new meaning. And when we get stuck in grieving the loss of that former state of consciousness, we create a self out of it. We create a problem out of it. And the brain could just be hibernating and resting and waiting for the next time. And if when our brain is slowed down from making meaning, we go back and harvest other aspects of that state, then it's good. Like, imagine if farmers had to harvest all the time when they were planting seeds. That would be a lot of work. So harvest, and then the brain rests and the seeds get planted and start to grow, and then they come up into awareness again. We're able to make more meaning out of it. And I remember one time being on a committee and they talked about the role functioning scale. So how do people rate in their role in like keeping clean or working or as a family member, whatever it is. And I think one of the aspects of a role functioning scale could be, are you creating your role in this world? Are you creating a new role? Are you creating towards that dream state of creative consciousness, of manic consciousness, of being in the now eternity consciousness instead of lost in history of what I should do or what I've been programmed to do to please others. So the thing is, in eternity consciousness, one realizes there are no others to please. We're all one. So who is there to please? But being one also does seem to necessitate having certain skills and certain perceptions. And I was thinking about it a little bit when I was driving the other day, because I have a car that has a little bit of autopilot function. Not super autopilot, but what I've noticed is, like, I drove over a hashed line and it doesn't always do the lane departure thing. But one time I was doing that, or what was happening, I was driving downhill and somebody was turning into a parking lot. And I was going slow enough that I knew I wasn't going to hit the car because they were going to keep going. But I wasn't pressing the brake because I could calculate that with my brain. But the car went like brake and like freaked out. So the car's freaking out for no reason. And then I tested it again, and there was another car turning in the thing. I did the same thing. The car did the same thing. It freaked out when I knew I wasn't going to hit that. And I had time to stop if they did stop for some reason. And then another time I pulled it over a bit over a hash line, and the car actually slammed on the brakes. I didn't slam on the brakes, the car did. And so this is a safety feature, you know, because I don't know what, but what I'm trying to say is, you know, we're driving the car in our life, feeling like we're making choices and we have free will. But what happens in so-called mania, it seems, is that once we go out of bounds, once we go over that line too far, like lane departure, we might be allowed to depart to some extent, but once at a certain point, the universe puts on the brakes. Just like these car technology automation features can put the brakes on for us. And the thing is that it makes it a little bit more confusing. Like I might even turn these things off in my car because I don't want it to slam on the brakes when, but sometimes I found it a little helpful that it beeps at me to brake. So when one realizes there's this power outside of us, it seems, that is guiding us or helping us in some way, it can almost make it a little bit more confusing because, you know, we're driving along in our life, and then all of a sudden the universe puts on the brakes and we don't even see why. We're like, what the hell? So, you know, there is some kind of algorithm in the universe that eventually makes us go back into history consciousness, or okay, it's time to put on the brakes. It's time to de-energize the brain. You know, some people experience this in a so-called rapid cycling way. There are different rhythms, so I'm not really sure as much about that type of rhythm. Yeah. So one day it would be nice if enough of us have talked enough about this stuff where it's not a bunch of disjointed memes, but we all sort of understand. We all understand the process of understanding for ourselves in our own subjectivity, that what we understand by perceiving what we see in the moment in our own subjectivity is more important than what we've been told and have committed to memory, and then project and try to move based on that projection. And moving based on a projection and not based on actually what's here now that's the crazy thing. So when we come back into history consciousness, our role in a way is to show people that they're crazy for living based on projection and routine and habit. And yeah. And then also, when one works to eliminate the fear of the algorithm switch, like there's a fear when the brain slows down. One doesn't want to go back to that other way of consciousness. Then the system of thought that is psychiatry cannot get us anymore. And when we realize that, then we don't feel as afraid, because mostly what is fearful is what happens to us when we're in the line of sight of psychiatry. To some extent, you know, I actually feel I could get captured again at some point if the universe puts the brakes on in that way. It is a way that the universe puts the brakes on, and then we could just keep going. Just keep making more meaning and keep going with that. And I've been thinking about how I don't know how much longer I want to make meaning like this. I'll keep going like this for at least another month, and then I will be going to California. Maybe I will decide not to make meaning as much, but really enjoy the people there. Last time I was there for a number of months, I was really focused on tapering off meds, and I did manage to do that and stay off them for 5 months. So I know that that's possible. But it's not as important to me now. It'd be more important for me to be able to connect with people down there. And I'm assuming, based on my experience, that I'll be able to take less meds. And And we'll see how that goes. But again, it's not like a goal for me. Oh, I have to be off the meds. And part of it is because, and I've said this before, because I've built so much meaning for myself, I've gotten to the point where I see what matters, and what matters is light. And the infinite light and energy of the universe cannot be destroyed by a little pill, a little bit of chemical. It can't destroy the brain, ultimately. When the brain is super tied up with thoughts, and then the chemicals go in and they're affecting the thoughts, and nothing new is coming into play, then definitely the brain could shrink. But when one is making meaning for oneself, the meds might be working on the thought circuits, but the more meaning we make, the less we need the thought circuits anyway. Like even this last few months, and when my brain executive functioning wasn't really working, I wasn't depressed. I just went out, hung out with friends, went to different places, had a shower, got up every day, just went out and about. There was no depression. I was still able to function because I wasn't trying to do that which my brain couldn't do at that moment. So I wasn't grieving the loss of anything. And I learned a lot. So it could be a matter of figuring that part out. There was no self to get depressed. I wasn't doing anything for the self when I was just going out and eating. I was feeding the body. I was moving the body around in space, but I wasn't trying to really do anything with the doer. And it's the doer realizing that it can't do anything that's depressed. And there is no doer, and the doer's thought. So that's why decoupling from thought is really important. It's quite simply complex.